It all began with a small scratch on George's arm. He hurt himself while playing in the yard, and no one paid much attention. Mummy cleaned the wound. Daddy said it would heal by morning. But by the next morning, nothing had changed. More than that, Peppa noticed George had become different. He didn't laugh, didn't ask to play dinosaurs, didn't run after her in the garden. Instead, he sat by the window, staring off into the distance. His little fingers twisted a toy absent-mindedly, but his eyes, they were empty, as if he wasn't looking outside at all, but falling inward into endless darkness. "George," Peppa called softly. He turned his head slowly, and a smile flickered on his lips. But it wasn't her brother's smile. There was no warmth, no joy in it. It was something foreign. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. With each passing day, George grew quieter. He ate less and less, even refused his favorite ice cream. His skin paled, shadows deepened under his eyes. And one evening, Peppa caught a strange smell. It came from George, damp earth, mold, as if he had spent hours lying in some wet basement. She tried to tell their parents. "Something's wrong with George, he's scaring me." But Mummy only stroked her head. "Don't make things up, darling. George is just tired." Peppa knew. It wasn't tiredness. That night, a faint sound woke her. A soft scratching, like claws dragging across the floorboards. Peppa slowly sat up in bed and saw George. He was standing in the darkness in the middle of the room, motionless. Moonlight fell across his face, and his eyes reflected it, so that they looked completely white. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly and smiled again. The next few days were a nightmare for her. She was afraid to be alone with him. His presence made the air cold, as if he carried dampness into the house. Sometimes Peppa thought he had stopped breathing altogether. He sat still like a doll, and only minutes later would he take one long, heavy breath. And then, one night, what she feared most happened. A dull thud woke her. Peppa opened her eyes and saw George. He was lying on the floor, his body twisting as if something inside was breaking him apart. Two dark bulges pushed through his back with a sickening crack. They grew, tore through, and within moments became wings. Enormous, leathery, black. Peppa screamed, but no sound came out. George lifted his head. His hands were no longer hands. Long claws scraped against the floor. From his mouth came an inhuman cry. "I'm not George anymore!" A violent gust of wind shattered the window. With one beat of his new wings, George shot upward. Glass rained down. Wind roared into the room. Peppa shielded her face. When she dared to look again, her brother was gone. On the floor lay his toy dinosaur, smeared with black slime that spread slowly across the boards. Peppa collapsed onto the bed and wept. She didn't know where to run, what to do. Her parents, it seemed, hadn't even stirred from the noise. The next morning, no one spoke of George. His chair at the table was empty, but Mummy and Daddy acted as if it had always been so. "Where's George?" Peppa asked desperately. Mummy looked at her calmly. "We've only ever had you, Peppa." Those words struck harder than the nightmare itself. She realized George wasn't just gone physically. His very memory was being erased. But Peppa remembered. A few nights later, a knock woke her. Soft, deliberate, against the window. She slowly opened her eyes and saw him. George, but not him. His face was elongated. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow. Wings stretched behind him, blocking out the moonlight. His mouth opened, and from it came a whisper. "You're next, Peppa." She tried to scream, but her throat closed and no sound escaped. And then she saw Labubu. He was sitting on the windowsill. His eyes burned red. His smile was wider than ever. The toy shook his head slowly, as if saying, "I can't help you." Peppa pressed her hooves to her face, her heart pounding wildly. She knew then, George was only the beginning. Labubu was not there to protect her. He was part of this nightmare, and now he was waiting. It was very early in the morning when Peppa first heard it. She was sleeping peacefully in her bed when a soft, rhythmic knocking came from her bedroom door. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard a voice, monotone and strange, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Tun, tun, tun, sahur." Peppa sat up in her bed, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Who's there?" she called out, but the knocking continued. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," came the voice again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of her fear, and Peppa slowly approached the door. When she opened it, she gasped. Standing in the hallway was a strange yellow creature with large round eyes and a wooden stick in its hand. The creature looked at Peppa with those unblinking eyes and said just one word, "Sahur." Before Peppa could ask any questions, the creature turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Peppa closed the door quickly, her heart pounding, but sleep would not come again that night. The next morning at breakfast, Peppa tried to tell her family about the strange visitor. "Mummy, Daddy, someone came to my room this morning. They were knocking and saying tun 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 sahur," she explained excitedly. Daddy Pig just laughed. "Peppa, you must have been dreaming. Sahur is just a morning meal that some people have. Your imagination is getting the better of you." Mummy Pig nodded in agreement. "Yes, dear, don't make up scary stories. Now eat your breakfast." But just as they were talking, a rhythmic tapping sound came from outside the house. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" Peppa jumped up from her chair. "Do you hear that?" "That's him!" she cried. The family listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Later that day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden when the yellow creature appeared again. It emerged from behind the bushes, still carrying its wooden stick, and began walking slowly around their yard. "Tun, tun, tun," it said monotonously, tapping the stick against the ground with each word. George hid behind Peppa, frightened by the strange visitor. Peppa, though scared, tried to be brave. "What do you want?" she asked. The creature stopped and looked at her. It held out its stick, offering it to Peppa. "Sahur," it said simply. Peppa didn't take the stick. She watched as the creature continued its slow walk around the garden, tapping and chanting its mysterious phrase. That night, Peppa had terrible nightmares. She dreamed she was trapped in a dark room, surrounded by dozens of yellow creatures, all carrying sticks and chanting "Tun Tun Tun Sahur" in perfect unison. When she woke up in a cold sweat, she looked out her window and saw the creature standing in the garden, staring up at her room. Days passed, and something strange began happening to Peppa's family. They became quiet and listless. Every morning they would sit at the breakfast table in complete silence, eating their food without speaking, then drift apart to their rooms like sleepwalkers. One morning, Peppa watched in horror as Daddy Pig picked up a wooden spoon and began tapping it against the table. "Tun, tun, tun," he said in the same monotone voice as the creature. Soon, Mummy Pig joined in, and then George, all of them tapping and chanting together. The final morning came when Peppa ran outside, desperate to escape the strange behavior of her family. But what she saw in the garden made her blood run cold. The entire yard was filled with yellow creatures, all holding wooden sticks. In the center stood her family, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George, each holding a stick of their own. They all turned to look at Peppa with blank, emotionless eyes. "Tun, tun, tun, sahur," they chanted in unison, their voices blending with those of the creatures around them. One of the yellow beings approached Peppa and held out a wooden stick. Peppa looked at her transformed family, then at the stick being offered to her. She realized there was no escape. No way back to the life she once knew. Slowly, with trembling hands, Peppa reached out and took the stick. "Sahur," she whispered, her voice already beginning to match the monotone of the others. And so Peppa joined her new family, walking slowly around the garden with the yellow creatures, tapping her stick and chanting the endless phrase that had consumed them all. The morning ritual had claimed another victim, and somewhere in the distance the sound of "tun tun tun sahur" continued to echo, waiting for the next family to find. That day, Peppa and her little sister Ivy were playing happily in their room. Peppa was building a tall tower with blocks, while Ivy, always a curious little one, was exploring every corner of the room. Suddenly, Ivy noticed something under Peppa's bed. She crawled over and pulled out a strange yellow toy with huge black eyes and sharp, realistic-looking teeth. The little one clapped her hands joyfully, hugging the find close to herself. Peppa was surprised. She had never seen this toy before. On the tag was written a strange name, Labubu. "Ivy, where did you get this toy? I've never seen it before," said Peppa, examining the strange creature. "What a weird name. And its teeth look so real." Despite the uneasy feeling, Peppa let Ivy play with the new toy. And then, something incredible happened. A second window appeared in the room, one that had never been there before. Behind this dark window stretched a gloomy forest with trees resembling the silhouettes of Labubu toys. "What is this? Where did this window come from?" exclaimed Peppa in shock. But Ivy seemed completely oblivious to the new window. She was entirely absorbed in playing with Labubu. Little Ivy pressed the toy to her ear, as if listening to something very important. She smiled and nodded her head, as if agreeing with something. "Ivy, who are you talking to?" asked the worried Peppa. But the little one just continued hugging the toy and smiling. When their mother entered the room, Peppa tried to tell her about the strange window and toy. "Mummy, look! A second window appeared in our room, and Ivy is talking to this strange toy," Peppa said excitedly, but their mother couldn't see anything. For her, there was only an ordinary wall, and Ivy was simply playing by herself. "You have quite an imagination, Peppa," said their mother, and left, unaware of the approaching danger. "But Mummy, it's right here!" cried Peppa, but it was useless. As night fell, events took an even more sinister turn. Peppa couldn't sleep, watching the dark window. Meanwhile, Ivy, hugging Labubu, began humming a strange, mesmerizing melody. The little one couldn't speak yet, but she hummed this tune as if she had known it her whole life. "Labubu, Labubu." "Ivy, what are you singing? How do you know this song?" asked Peppa fearfully, but Ivy just continued humming and rocking with the toy. Peppa looked at the second window and was horrified. Behind the glass, dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing. An entire army of Labubu toys was watching them from the dark forest. The next night, the most terrible thing happened. Peppa woke up to an unusual silence. Ivy's crib was empty. The Labubu toy had also disappeared. The second window was wide open, and in the forest, Peppa saw the retreating silhouette of her little sister. Ivy was walking, holding hands with a large figure that looked like Labubu. "Ivy, come back!" screamed Peppa, but it was too late. Ivy disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, and the window behind her closed and dissolved into the wall as if it had never existed. In the morning, their parents searched the entire house, the entire neighborhood, but Ivy was nowhere to be found. Mummy cried, Daddy called the police, and Peppa remained silent. She knew the truth, but who would believe her? A whole year passed. Peppa learned to live with this terrible secret. She played alone in her room, which now seemed too big and empty without Ivy's laughter. And then one day, while cleaning under her bed, Peppa found a small teddy bear. It was so cute and harmless. "What a lovely bear," smiled Peppa, picking it up. But as soon as she lifted the teddy bear, that same dark window appeared in the room again. Behind the glass stood Ivy. But this was no longer the cheerful little one that Peppa remembered. Ivy's skin had turned yellow, and her eyes were black, just like Labubu's. In her hands, she held that same cursed toy and slowly waved her hand. Although Ivy couldn't speak, Peppa seemed to hear her voice in her head. "Join us, big sister." Peppa dropped the teddy bear in horror. She realized that the nightmare was just beginning, and now Labubu had come for her. Peppa Pig, the forgotten friend, and Labubu. One day, Peppa was rummaging through an old wardrobe when her attention was drawn to a large photo album covered in a thick layer of dust. The cover was worn, the page edges charred with age, and the album itself smelled of dampness, as if it had been hidden in a basement for years. Carefully, Peppa blew off the dust and opened it. On the first pages were ordinary pictures, family walks, holidays, their house and garden. But soon she came across photographs where a sheep in a blue dress stood beside her. The smile of this girl looked strangely familiar, yet Peppa could not recall her. Beneath the photos was written, "Peppa and Lucy." Peppa's heart tightened with a strange feeling. She couldn't remember Lucy at all, but looking at the photographs filled her with a sense of longing, as if she had lost something very important. At dinner that evening, Peppa gathered her courage. "Mum, Dad, who is Lucy?" Her parents exchanged glances. "Lucy," repeated Mummy Pig. "We don't know any Lucy, dear. You've never had a friend with that name." "But she's in the photographs," insisted Peppa. Daddy Pig frowned and muttered, "You must be mistaken." Their answers only deepened her unease. Peppa felt they were deliberately avoiding the truth. That same night, she opened the album again and noticed that there were more photos than before. New ones had appeared between the pages, ones she was certain hadn't been there earlier. In them, Lucy stood close to Peppa, hugging her, holding her hoof. On one picture, at the bottom, in thin handwriting, it read, "Do you remember me?" From that moment, the strangeness only grew. In her toy box, Peppa found a doll that looked remarkably like Lucy. Its woolen face was slightly faded, the blue dress cracked and torn, as though it had lain forgotten for decades. Peppa was certain this doll had never been there before. Soon, drawings began to appear around the house, in charcoal, in pencil, sometimes right on the walls. Everywhere was Lucy, at first smiling, then darker and darker with each sketch. Peppa increasingly felt the weight of an unseen gaze. Labubu, her favorite toy that always sat by her pillow, now looked different. His button eyes seemed alive, watching her every move. His smile, once sweet, now resembled a cruel smirk. Sometimes she noticed that Labubu was sitting in places she hadn't left him. One night, Peppa woke to a strange whisper. The room was quiet, George still asleep, but near the wardrobe stood an old wooden door. It looked as if it had always been part of the room, yet Peppa knew for certain it had never been there before. The whisper came from behind it. "Peppa, come to me. I will tell you everything." The voice was soft, almost gentle, yet it sent chills down her spine. Peppa sat up in bed. Labubu sat by her pillow and suddenly began to sway slowly from side to side. His eyes glimmered with a faint red light. The whisper grew stronger, more insistent, calling her name. Shaking, Peppa rose and stepped toward the door. The wooden handle chilled her hoof, as if someone on the other side was touching it too. "Remember me?" The voice echoed again. She slowly opened the door. Behind it was no room, no corridor, only emptiness, endless and dark. A cold wind struck her face, and before she could scream, the darkness pulled her inside. The door slammed shut with a long, heavy creak. The next morning, her parents entered the room to wake the children. George slept soundly, but Peppa's bed was empty. On the wall hung a new photograph. In it stood Lucy the sheep, and beside her, Peppa. but the expression on the girl's face was frightened, distant. At their feet sat Labubu. His eyes glowed red, and on his face was the same crooked smile that Lucy wore. Her parents found neither Peppa nor the album. Only a small doll, a copy of Lucy, lay on the floor near her bed, and no one, except Labubu, knew where Peppa had gone. It all started the day Peppa found a strange toy in her room. It was a Labubu, a small yellow monster with big black eyes and sharp teeth. Peppa couldn't remember where it came from. "What a cute toy! Where did you come from, little one?" she asked. Labubu remained silent, but his black eyes seemed to follow Peppa's every movement. That same day, a second window appeared in her room. The new window was old and dark, completely different from Peppa's usual window. Through the murky glass, instead of the familiar yard, there was a view of a gloomy, foggy forest. And strangest of all, in the forest grew trees that looked exactly like Labubu toys. "Mummy, look at this window and this strange forest," Peppa called out. But Mummy Pig replied, "Peppa dear, there's only one window in your room. And what's that toy you're holding?" Mummy couldn't see the second window, but even stranger, she couldn't see the Labubu toy either, even though Peppa was holding it right in front of her. On the first night, Peppa placed Labubu on her bedside table and went to sleep. But in the middle of the night, she woke up to a strange sound, the quiet grinding of teeth. In a quiet, creaky voice, Labubu whispered, "Peppa, Peppa, look out the window." You can talk," Peppa gasped. She turned to the second window. In the forest, she saw hundreds of small yellow figures, exactly like her toy. They stood between the trees, staring directly at her. Every night, the army of toy Labubus in the forest grew larger. They moved closer to the window, and their black eyes glowed in the darkness like little stars. "We've come for you, Peppa. You found us. Now we'll find you," Labubu said. "What do you want from me?" Peppa asked fearfully. "We want you to become one of us, forever," came the chilling reply. On the third night, Peppa woke up to find her hands had turned yellow, like Labubu's, and her eyes in the mirror seemed bigger and blacker than usual. "What's happening to me?" she cried. "You're becoming one of us. Soon you'll be able to live in our forest and we'll play forever," Labubu explained with a sinister smile. Peppa tried to throw away the Labubu toy, but it always returned to her room. She tried to close the second window, but it appeared on other walls. "Mummy! Daddy! Help me!" she screamed. But her parents couldn't see Labubu or hear his voice. To them, Peppa was just talking to herself. On the seventh night, the Labubu army came right up to the window. There were so many of them that the forest glowed with the yellow light of their bodies and the black gleam of their eyes. In chorus, they chanted, "It's time, Peppa. Time to join us." Peppa looked at herself in the mirror. Her skin had turned completely yellow. Her eyes were big and black, and the same horrifying smile as Labubu's appeared on her face. I'm ready," she said in a voice that now sounded like Labubu's. The second window opened by itself. Cold wind from the Labubu forest rushed into the room. Peppa, now looking more like a toy than a pig, stepped toward the window and disappeared into the night. In the morning, Mummy Pig came into Peppa's room to wake her up, but the bed was empty. On the windowsill lay only a small yellow Labubu toy with big black eyes. "Peppa, Peppa, where are you?" Mummy called out. She picked up the toy. For a moment, it seemed like Labubu winked at her and whispered quietly in a familiar voice, "I'm here, Mummy. I'll always be here." A week later, George found a strange toy in his room, a small yellow monster with big black eyes. And that same day, a second window appeared in his room. "Dinosaur! Dinosaur!" George exclaimed. "No, George, I'm Labubu, and soon you'll be Labubu too," the toy replied. In the forest beyond the window stood a figure that looked very much like Peppa, but with yellow skin and black eyes. She waved at George and smiled with Labubu's horrifying smile. Be careful with toys that appear out of nowhere. Sometimes they don't come to be played with, but to turn you into a toy.